Tag and willkommen to my third Germany vlog. And this time we're going to be looking at Bismarck and his um, uh, alliances in the Reichstag, and in particular the so-called Liberal era, his alliance with the National Liberals, and then the shift to allying with the Centre Party after the policy of Kulturkampf. So the first thing to say is that because of the setup of the 1871 constitution, that although Bismarck didn't like the idea of democracy, he had to play along with democracy to an extent. And that meant that he needed some support in the Reichstag. All laws, all legislation had to be passed through the Reichstag, and therefore it was handy to Bismarck to have support there so that he could get his policies and laws passed. And the obvious candidates for support and alliance in many ways in the early 1870s were the National Liberal Party. The National Liberal Party were actually not that national. They were a northern-based party supported mostly by middle class, particularly industrial and professional middle classes. And the reason that they were a good ally for Bismarck is that they were, firstly, pro-unification. They wanted to see a strong and united Germany. Secondly, they were very keen on economic liberal policies, including free trade and the creation of a kind of one internal German market. And these were the sort of things that Bismarck could definitely get on board and support with. And so in the liberal era, the National Liberals, led by Rudolf von Bessingen, actually support a lot of things that Bismarck puts forward. And they see the unification of, or the creation of a unified currency across Germany, the mark, and the creation of a unified commercial code covering business law across Germany, including a standardization of weights and measures, which obviously is quite essential, the removal of all internal tariffs, which is very important for free trade within Germany, and the creation of a civil and criminal code for Germany too, so that justice was the same across the whole of Germany and administered in the same sort of ways. These were very successful at creating a sense of what it meant to be German, what difference it made to live in Germany, and they helped stimulate the economy in Germany too. The National Liberals also supported one of the more controversial policies of Bismarck's era. I say that slightly loadedly. It is the most controversial, I think, of his policies, and that was the Kulturkampf. The Kulturkampf were a series of policies aimed against Catholics. Germany was about a third Catholic. About 37% of Germany at this time were Catholics, and they were felt to be, by both Bismarck and the National Liberals, a threat to national unity, a threat to sort of the survival or creation of a strong German state. In part, that was related to the policies of the current Pope at that time, Pope Pius IX, who back in 1864 had published what was called the Syllabus of Errors, where he had criticised modern governments and particularly liberalism as a kind of dangerous, corrosive thing to be resisted. In 1874, in 1870, Pope Pius IX backed that up. So in 1864, Syllabus of Errors, 1870, he backed that up with the doctrine of papal infallibility, where he said, if there's ever a dispute between your state and me, the Pope, between your state and the Church, then the Church is right. The Pope is never wrong. I'm infallible, he said. So these things seem to suggest to Bismarck and the National Liberals, as I said, that there was a danger that Catholics would be more loyal to the Pope and more loyal to their church and more loyal to Catholicism than they would to Germany. And because both Austria to the south and France to the west were Catholic nations, this was seen as kind of doubly problematic and doubly suspicious, I guess, doubled suspicions of Bismarck. Not least because some of these 37% of Germans that were Catholics were congregated in Alsace-and-Lorraine and in the Polish ethnic regions on the eastern borders of Germany, both areas of which are areas where Bismarck's, again, concerned about the loyalty of those citizens. So it follows that a bunch of laws are are brought into play, a bunch of policies are brought into play to restrict and persecute, really, Catholicism in Germany. These are introduced mostly into Prussia rather than across Germany, but one or two are introduced into the Reichstag as well. The key ones are in 1873 the May laws, which are introduced in Prussia by Adalbert Falk, F-A-L-K, and these, and then he backs that up in 1874. These policies reduce the influence of Catholicism over education. They bring in state inspection of all schools. They make the training and appointment of priests a state responsibility rather than leaving it up to churches. A Reichstag law was to ban the Jesuit order from the whole of Germany. The Jesuit order had been founded way back in history as quite a missionary sect group of Catholics, and explicitly going out into the world to try and show people how Catholicism was a great thing and to persuade people to join the Catholic order. So if you're looking to restrict the influence of Catholicism, then banning the Jesuit order was quite a standard way of doing that. And then they also made marriage a civil procedure. In 1875, these kind of reached their culmination, where a law is passed restricting funding for any parish that's resisting the implementation of these laws, and the closure of all religious orders except nursing orders, which presumably were still seen as being a good idea. The response of the papacy to this is, not surprisingly, to condemn it. Pope Pius IX in 1875 tells all Catholic priests to resist this, and all Catholics to resist this. And as a result, only 30 out of 10,000 Catholic priests actually do submit to these laws. By 1876, 10 out of 12 Prussian Catholic bishops were under house arrest as a result. The problem really with the Kulturkampf was just it wasn't effective in reducing Catholic support, and in many ways it can be seen as actually dividing Germany further. It tended to be that Polish and French Catholics, instead of initially supported kind of separatism, but then start to support the Centre Party as the sort of seat or the voice of opposition. And the Centre Party support actually grows from 58 seats in the Reichstag in 1871 to 91 seats in 1874. So, and Ludwig Windthorst, the leader of the Catholic Party, is seen as the Centre Party, rather, who are supported by Catholics, is seen as being one of the most effective German politicians of the era. So when the Pope died, Pope Pius IX died in 1878, for that reason, really, that it was ineffective, but also because France were actually themselves not being so pro-Catholic. The relations with Austria had calmed down from the early 1870s when they were quite tense, and also Bismarck was beginning to get quite worried about socialism as a different threat, and he'd recognised actually that Catholics maybe weren't as big a problem as he'd originally thought. For all these reasons, and taking advantage of the opportunity of Pope Pius IX dying, Bismarck actually pulls back on the Kulturkampf and makes his peace with the Centre Party. This means that poor old Falk has to resign from his position, but several of the policies do remain in place. For instance, the appointment of priests remains a state issue, Jesuits remain banned from Germany, and marriage remains a civil procedure. So it's not as if all the Kulturkampf is undone in the late 1870s, but the Catholic Church seemed to accept that their role and their rights are going to be restricted for some time. It's worth noting here that the Kulturkampf does not impact upon the ability of Catholics to worship as Catholics. So their religious rights are not restricted. It's the influence of the Church as a body, and particularly the influence of the Church, the Catholic Church as a body, looking outwards and those sort of attempts to influence and expand their ideas out into the population that are being seen as particularly problematic by Bismarck. The other issue, so the National Liberals liberalise the economy and support the Kulturkampf with Bismarck. The other issue that had arisen by the late 1870s was to do with trade, which had started off between 1871 and 1873. There'd been an economic boom, kind of fueled by the success in the Franco-Prussian War, largely, and the initial unification of Germany. But that had really slowed through the 1870s. Partly probably because there was over trading in the excitement of the early 1870s, but also because it was becoming easier to import things with the opening up of steam railroads and steam ships, bringing in wheat from Russia and America, and also trade with other countries physically around Germany. All this meant that several groups were now lobbying Bismarck, both agricultural and industrial groups, for the imposition of tariffs to protect German produce within Germany. This would be the imposing a tax upon foreign goods that were being brought in. Austria, France, and Russia had all imposed tariffs. Britain was the only country to be remaining free trade at this time. And Bismarck perhaps saw this as advantageous for several reasons. Firstly, he didn't really like the idea of allying with one party forever. Secondly, he'd probably run out of things that he agreed with the National Liberals on. They'd done all the sort of economic-y liberal things. And the National Liberals also wanted to push for politically liberal reforms to introduce further elements of democracy into Germany. And Bismarck really wasn't keen on that idea at all. And thirdly, Bismarck wanted to try and boost the German government's coffers, and a new tax, or particularly on foreign goods, would help with that. So there were several reasons for Bismarck to opt into this, and being the realpolitik, pragmatic politician that he was, this was a good time to do it. And so in 1878, he comes out in favour of tariffs, and some historians certainly see this as being significant in the National Liberal support declining in that election from 27% down to 23%. And the following year, Bismarck manages to bring a tariff law tariff bill into the Reichstag in 1879. And that bill actually helps split the National Liberals into two parts, a conservative part and a part that remains more liberal. Thereby, into the 1880s and actually well beyond, the National Liberals are removed as a dominant political force. However, so happy days. Yeah, Bismarck has done some good things for the National Liberals. He's really helped to create a sense of what Germany is. The Kulturkampf has been, successfully prosecuted as a policy. It hasn't really worked, and Bismarck has in many ways made things more difficult for himself in that sense. But by 1879, he has solved those problems with the Centre Party and has created an alliance with them to move forward against socialism, which we'll perhaps think about next time. That said, he has in many ways made cooperating in the Reichstag more difficult by splitting the National Liberals and by removing them as the largest party. And going forward into the 1880s, the Liberal alliance of several parties joining together becomes increasingly problematic for him, as well as him now having to ally with the Centre Party, with whom he does not share quite as many policy goals as he would have done the National Liberals at the start of the 1870s. I hope that's helpful. It's quite a lot there. Next time I'll think about the policies towards ethnic minorities and the socialists, and we'll see how Bismarck handles those things. See you then. Auf Wiedersehen.